like to extend a warm welcome to our distinguished guest speaker, Professor Gopalkrishnan, who has kindly accepted our invitation and graciously agreed to share his expertise and knowledge with us today. We are truly honored to have you, sir. I also welcome Dr. Harendra Kumar Behera, President TIES, who has accepted our invitation to chair the session. Dr. Harendra Behera is an accomplished researcher and policymaker, having around 2 decades of experience working as a director economist in the Department of Economic Policy and Research in Reserve Bank of India. He has served as editor of RBI report occasional papers on full capital account convertibility, BOPs, etc. And he has one book to his credit. The book title is The Central Bank Intervention in Forex Market and Indian Experience. And he has published good amount of research paper on Journal of Reputi, International Reputi, such as Journal of Policy Modeling, Journal of Future Market, and Journal of Asian Economics, etc. He has PhD in economics from University of Hyderabad, and at last but not the least, he is also awarded with the Central Bank Research Fellowship Award from the Bank of International Settlement. I request our president to take over here onwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Chinmay. Good morning, everyone. It is my distinct honor and privilege to introduce our esteemed speaker for today's distinguished lecture, Dr. Badri Narayan Gopalkrishnan. Dr. Gopalkrishnan is a renowned economist with an impressive career spanning over 2 decades. He currently serves as a senior economist and affiliate faculty member at University of Washington, Seattle, and a non-resident fellow at Niti Aayog. His expertise encompasses a wide range of fields, including international trade, disruptive technology, energy, industry, and public health. Dr. Gopalkrishnan has made significant contributions to the development of the Global Trade Analysis Project GTAP database and model extensions at Purdue University. His work has informed major economic policies worldwide, including free trade agreements and technology regulations. He is also a co-founder of Infinite Sum Modeling, a global consulting firm with a presence in multiple countries. In addition to his academic and professional achievements, Dr. Gopalkrishnan has been a consultant to numerous prestigious organizations such as the World Bank, the UN, IMF, WTO, ADB, ILO, FAO, uh, and so many institutions and companies like McKinsey and Company and PwC, like that. He has also published over 150 papers and 8 books and presented his work in more than 30 countries. Today, Dr. Gopal Krishnan will share his insights on the global economic implications of decarbonization, a topic of immense relevance as we navigate the challenges and opportunities of transitioning to a sustainable, low carbon economy. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Badrinaran Gopalkrishnan. Dr. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Harendra. It's wonderful to be part of this forum, and also good to reconnect with you after a long time, and also other colleagues. Many of them I may already know. So thank you very much for inviting me. Let me share my screen. So I hope you can all see the screen now. So the topic I have chosen to discuss today about is a very contemporary topic, which has been um, quite deeply discussed and debated by policymakers across the world, and also top business leaders in the industry as well. So that is the global economic impact of decarbonization. Apart from the reason that this is very topical, I chose this topic because this forum I know is full of economists who have a lot of caliber and experience in research of international quality. So I wanted to discuss about some issues which are both practically relevant and contemporary, but also very rigorously done using quantitative methods. So part of the objective of this is also to showcase some of the methodologies being used here, and also the next few minutes of presentation that I'm going to give is based on a few different projects we have completed for different organizations, such as Asian Development Bank, African Exim Bank, African Development Bank, and the World Bank, and Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, also Government of India, and so on. So several institutions. We have done different projects for all these organizations. So this is more like drawn from all these different studies. So those of you who are interested in learning more can connect with me, and I can send you the published studies. So all these studies are published actually. So it's kind of a synthesis of all these studies. So let me start with particularly the work we have done with ADB, which is published, Asian Development Bank. So the objective of this particular study was to understand the macroeconomic implications of the carbon emission targets for 2030 based on the Paris Agreement, and also further made further more ambitious by the Copenhagen Accord, and also the COP 28 and so on the economic and global value chain aspects and parameters for the Southeast Asian countries, particularly the members of ASEAN. Similarly, we also did work on Middle East and North Africa, African regions, and India and other South Asian regions as well. So just to be keep my discussion within the time frame, I'll mainly focus on the Southeast Asian countries, and others I'll mention towards them. So the idea is to understand the macroeconomic implications, looking at the various sectors and the potential for renewables, understanding the potential for renewables, and also more importantly, looking at the global supply chain parameters because of this carbon emissions targets. So the modeling framework used for this purpose is a CG model, or computable general equilibrium model. And a CG model, I will briefly talk about it in a few minutes. But this basically captures the linkages between different sectors and countries, and also various agents within an economy, consumers, firms, governments, and so on. And I always think of these models as what we call as theory of numbers. So it's a theoretical system calibrated with real-world data and parameters. So it is fully consistent with the standard economic theories, and at the same time, it is impregnated with a lot of data, real-world data. That brings us to the data. So the database that we use is called GTAP, or Global Trade Analysis Project, and the model is also called GTAP, and I'll explain later again. It is a global economic data set. It links country IO tables from various countries with international trade, protection data, macroeconomic data, energy and agricultural data sets. So basically, The country IoT tables, obviously, they have a lot of national data set, but also there are all these, international organizations that focus on specific aspects like trade protection and macro energy and agriculture, and that is typically more accurate and more comprehensive compared to the country level data sets, and more harmonized also. So this data set combines all these different things and then comes up with a consistent data set based on a wide range of official public data sources. So now going a little deeper into what is the CGE model, and GTAP as an example. So you have this is more like a circular flows diagram, which we are quite familiar with in general, but this is also the structure of this model. So you have consumers going to the product markets and purchasing from the producers. So these are basically the household consumption of domestic products, household consumption of imports from the rest of the world. And then you have similar thing for the government, government consumption of domestic products and government consumption of imports. And so the when you say consumers, it's the overall economy. You can call it like national income. The national income, one part of it goes to the private consumption expenditure, another part of it goes to government expenditure, and then the residual goes to savings. And that savings from every country is collected to an entity, hypothetical entity called Global Bank, and that then allocates those into different countries as regional investment based on the return on investment in that particular country. So this is how the savings are allocated to investment, and that is then used by the producers to produce. And the producers also have two types of consumption. One is consumption of domestic intermediate inputs, consumption of imported intermediate inputs. So, for example, if there is a car factory would probably buy steel from domestic companies, or it may import steel from other countries. So both are possible. Similarly, the producers can export their goods and to the rest of the world. So the direction of flow that we show in the arrow marks, that is the direction of flow of the value of the money. And so basically the government pays money to the producers to purchase products. Similarly, government pays the rest of the world to get the purchase the goods and services. So this is how we typically work on. In terms of agents, there are firms who take into account the inter-industry trade and linkages between the different industries. And the government, allows for taxes and subsidies and so on, and how this expenditure can affect multiple sectors. Rest of the world, actually, here just for simplicity, we show this as one rest of the world, but every country is linked to every other country. So it's very difficult to show in a figure, but it's very it's all happening at bilateral level. So then the global bank is, I already told you how savings is converted into investment. So whenever you see two arrow marks coming from a particular agent, that is basically a substitution. So there is substitution between domestic and imports for household consumption, and the same for government consumption, and the same for production also, producers consumption as well. And similarly, there is a Cobb-Douglas function between these, and for at the highest level, at the income going into private consumption, government consumption, savings, and so on. So we'll all again revisit this in a theoretical way. Now I showed you in an illustrated way. So now to just reaffirm what is CGE modeling. So it is basically computable general equilibrium. So general equilibrium is, as all of us may be aware, it is equilibrium in all the sectors in the economy. So it is economy-wide, which actually implicitly assumes that there is enough time to achieve equilibrium. In real world, we see there is always disequilibrium, but there is, if you give enough time, every market reaches equilibrium separately, and then there will be disequilibrium by the time other markets get into equilibrium. But here we assume that there is enough time to for the entire economy to get into an equilibrium situation. Um, that is why it is called general equilibrium. And then you have this prefix computable, and which actually means that the solution can be computed. So that's why it's called a computable general equilibrium model, because as you know, the general equilibrium was developed by Kenneth Arrow and Debreu, and then it was a theory for a long time until Leontief came up with the input-output system, input-output table, and those kind of numerical methods, which were then combined probably in the 1960s, early 1960s is when the CG models came to some shape in the beginning, and then they got complex over time. So the CG models are also called applied general equilibrium models, AGE models, and they're typically based on neoclassical theories of production, consumption, trade, etc. But we can also use alternative theories. So these are the agents you have. These are the components of the CGE model. So agents are typically producers and consumers. We saw in the flowchart that producers also can be consumers, because producer can be consumers of intermediate inputs, and consumers are basically government and private, the final demand categories. Factor endowments are land, labor, capital, natural resources. Typically, sometimes we may have more factors, but these are the typical factors. Of course, we can have different categories in terms of labor and so on. Commodities, there are different products, there are goods, there are services, and there are markets for commodities, supply and demand, factor endowment, supply and demand. So when there are n markets, if n-1 markets have equilibrium, if they obey the equilibrium condition, then the nth market also should obey the equilibrium condition. That is basically what is called as Walras law. Then this model also allows you to do welfare analysis. So now coming to a very specific model, that is GTAP model, Global Trade Analysis Project. That is the only model that is publicly freely available. And the other models, like for example, Globe model, it is definitely available if you undergo the training program that they conduct. It's done by some of my academic colleagues in the UK. So they developed it in UK and also in US. So they developed it, and then if you go through their course, they'll give you access to it, but it's not publicly freely available. Envisage model is developed and maintained by the World Bank, and it is internal use for internal use of World Bank colleagues. Linkage is for the OECD colleagues. Impact is for the IFPRI, International Food Policy Research Institute colleagues. Usage is used within the United States Department of Agriculture. Then there are many India-centric CGE models. So NCAR has developed models since a long time ago. IGDR also has developed some models, particularly under Professor Kirit Parikh and Professor Ganesh Kumar, Professor Manoj Panda, and others. And also IEG model has some similarities with that. So there are many India-specific models also, but these are all maintained by individual researchers and not publicly available. So this is what brings us to the GTAP, Global Trade Analysis Project. As I mentioned before, that's the only publicly available dataset and model. So it was actually established in the 90s, late 80s, early 90s in Purdue University. And the main reason why it was established was to have freely, publicly accessible data set and model, so that policymakers can have a common language in which they can communicate. Because during the GATT negotiations, every country had its own model, and they all claimed to be standard CGE models, but they would give very different results. So there was no common mode of communication. So GTAP was developed by definition. It was developed as an open source model so that everyone can see the code. Support for the model for the whole project came from the World Bank to begin with, then the UN, and many governments, US, Japan, Australia, World Trade Organization, International Trade Center, MIT, and other academic organizations. Also, European Commission and some of the universities in Germany and so on. In fact, the firm that Dr. Harindra mentioned, which is a firm that I had established, Infinite Modeling. So we are also a board member there. So there are over 30,000 researchers across the world using this for policy research and analysis, and it is quite accessible and at the same time quite complex and comprehensive. So this is same as the one that I explained to you earlier, and of course we have included some technical names that we give in the model. but I'll skip this because we have already gone through this. Now, I just wanted to still give you a broad theoretical explanation. So GTAP is a multi-sector, multi-region comparative static model where you compare the world that exists today with a world in which certain policy shocks are implemented, so that you can compare the two. So we also have a dynamic version, which is what you use in some of our studies, in which there is capital accumulation, uh, capital investment, joining with the productive capital in the economy and so on. And there are different model components. For example, there is a regional household, which receives all income in the economy, and then it spends, towards government consumption, private consumption, and savings, based on a Cobb-Douglas utility function, which essentially means that the shares of government, these three categories of consumption, or the three categories of income spending would be the same as the before and after the shock. I already told you about savings getting converted into investment through global bank. When you look at firms, they have intermediate demand and factor demand. So the intermediate demand is for, the example I gave you was auto industry consuming steel. Factor demand is land, labor, capital. So both are there, and there is a leonti of complementarity between the two at an aggregate level, but there is substitution between them, within them. For example, there is substitution between land, labor, capital, and but at the aggregate level between intermediate and factors, there is no substitution. Product demand happens from the government, and for the government, the product demand is using a Cobb-Douglas function. For the private consumption, it is using a demand system called constant difference elasticity, CDE. I already told you about investment coming from savings, and the typical assumptions are zero profit or perfect competition and constant returns to scale. But we also have variants where we have non-zero profits and decreasing returns, increasing returns to scale. International trade is very important part of the model. So we assume Armington assumption, which is basically imperfect substitution between domestic and imports, and also imports from different sources. So we have a constant elasticity substitution here, and that is a lot of the elasticity in the model are estimated using econometrics. And then we also have transport services for shipping, for international trade, and so on. And there are equilibrium conditions. So that's about the model. Coming to the data set, we have the input-output tables, and then we combine the input-output tables from each country with the agricultural data set from FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization, macro data from World Bank and IMF, trade data from UN, protection data from International Trade Center, energy data from International Energy Agency, IEA. So we combine all these different things. The IO tables are combined with those things. We call them fitted IO tables, where they're fitted with all these international sources of data. And then you combine that with the econometrically estimated parameters, and also the primary factors, land, labor, capital, they have splits. Then you have income and factor taxes. You assemble them to get the GTAP database. So now I've given you a broad idea about the methodology. So now I'll come to the specific strategy we do for this particular analysis for the objectives that I already told you. So we use something similar to an integrated assessment framework, in which we combine three different types of GTAP models. As I told you, what I've been discussing is the standard GTAP model, but there are many different variants. So for example, there is GTAP E model, which takes into account energy and emissions and environmental aspects. GTAP power model, which also takes into account the different sources of electricity, like renewables, different renewables, non-renewables, and so on. And GTAP VA, or value-added model, which actually takes into account the multi-region input-output model, or basically the global value chain aspect of the model. The first aspect is GTAP E-power model, where we take into account the economic impact of changing emissions and potential for renewable technologies. GTAP VA model takes into account the impact of a change in emissions on the components of gross trade. So we use version 10 at that point, and we did this analysis. Nowadays, we use version 12, which is in beta version now. But basically, it's 41 countries and regions which are taken from the 141 countries and regions in GTAP. So GTAP has so many regions, but we aggregate them to 41. Similarly, there are 65 sectors in the model, but we aggregate them to 39. And the database is also updated because the base data for base year for the data set is 2014, but we aggregate update it to 2020. And then we also update the model to make sure that in every country there is an increase in renewable power capacity from 2014 to 20, and there is also decrease in renewable power costs over time. And then we have two different scenarios. First scenario is what we call as business as usual, assuming that each country would achieve whatever emission reductions happen between 2010 and 20. So in the last 10 years, whatever emission reductions happen, that will continue from 2020 to 30. That's a business as usual. In many cases, as I'll tell you later, emissions actually increased between these 2 years. Then we assume that they don't increase further, they are frozen. Whereas the NDC scenario, or nationally determined contribution scenario, we actually implement the emissions reduction. So the emissions in the model are endogenous by default, which means that all this economic activity happening, they would affect emissions, because to produce cars, you need steel. To produce steel, you need coal. And when you use coal, you generate carbon emissions. So all this kind of carbon intensity of various fuels are taken into account, and that's how we have the emissions. But we can also in the model assume that the emissions are exogenous by imposing carbon taxes. So carbon taxes will be endogenous, and based on the carbon taxes, you will see a reduction in fossil fuels use and increase in renewables use, for example. So these are the different steps involved. So we first create an aggregated data set with 41 regions and 49 sectors. Then we merge the emissions data with the economic data. Then we scale the data to 2020. Then we increase the renewable power capacity in each country using the IRENA's data, International Renewable Energy Agency, their country level data. And then we also take into account the reduction in price of renewable, again coming from IRENA. Then the scenario 1 and 2 I already mentioned, and then we analyze the macro impact, and then use the macro impact coming from the GTAP power model, and then we feed that into the GTAP VA model, the value added model, to see what is happening to the foreign and domestic value added. So before getting into the model results, I wanted to give you a broad picture of what is happening based on the simple data analysis and literature review. So electricity is about 40% of total energy consumed globally, and 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So because it plays a prominent role in fossil fuel combustion, electricity has become a common target for various environment, energy, and carbon mitigation policies. Because even if we take, for example, transportation, which is another important sector, we are increasingly moving towards electric mobility. So electric vehicles are becoming a big deal. So now electric mobility, electric vehicles would be green only if the electricity sector becomes green. So that is why electricity becomes really the important sector, and that is why we focus on that. And now if you look at the ASEAN region, under what we call as unconditional pledges, which is basically the pledge to reduce emissions, irrespective of any aid or technological transfer that they may get from the developed countries. So that is around 400 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, which indicates that ASEAN may have to reduce their emissions by 11% by 2030 related to its current trajectory. So it's by 2030, whatever it's going to emit, it has to reduce it by 11%. Under conditional pledges, where there are more ambitious global efforts and technological and financial transfers from the developed countries to the developing countries. And then the emission gap is about 900 metric tons of CO2 equivalent, which indicates a reduction of 24%, almost double, more than double compared to this. Now, what is the reality? So this is all what is the next target in the next few years. But what is the reality? It is between 2010 and 20. The picture is quite bleak because all the ASEAN countries have increased their emissions. Singapore is the only exception. They have reduced their emissions by 19%, but at an aggregate level, ASEAN countries have increased their emissions by 34% between these two. So basically, in terms of absolute terms, it is the total emissions by ASEAN is around 1,700 metric tons of CO2 in 2020. So it has further increased in the last couple of years, last few years. So, but this may give you an impression that the emissions are increasing, nobody is doing anything. But the reality is they are taking a lot of efforts. ASEAN's renewable power capacity is now 79 gigawatts, which is almost a doubling from 2014. So 89% increase. ASEAN solar capacity alone has increased by more than 14 times, 1,320% to 23 gigawatts. Obviously, we are starting from a lower base, but still the jump is big. Similarly, the hydro capacity also has increased 34% by 2020. So there's always been a lot of efforts taken by the countries, but given the pace at which these countries are growing and given the energy demand, it seems to be not sufficient. So now let's go to the results in particularly for this ASEAN study. Others I'll just verbally discuss, but I'll just focus on ASEAN. So we see that in the first scenario, when there is business as usual, very minimal change in GDP and small decreases in exports, imports, and output. All these are in percentage changes compared to the baseline. Baseline as in a baseline in which there is no constraint on the emissions. Here there is constraint on emissions still. We are at least not allowing emissions to increase in scenario 1. In scenario 2, we are allowing emissions to decrease based on the indices. So here you can see that the GDP fall is around 2%, 1.7%. Exports and imports fall much more, 6% and 8%. Output increase falls a little less. So now if you go to the sectoral results for the entire region, we see that the renewables are green, they are increasing mostly. Transportation is also, it's a mixed picture, increasing and decreasing in certain countries. But yes, there is, compared to many other sectors, services and transportation are more, are less negative, whereas all other sectors are more negative. So that's what we see at an aggregate level. Now, let me just look at one of the large economies there, like Indonesia. To look at it briefly, in scenario 1, we see that the domestic value added of coal decreased by 3%, gas decreased by 0.3%. Basically, because coal is a very carbon-intensive fuel, it falls a lot, but gas falls only a little bit because gas is not a very emission-intensive fuel. But at the same time, if you see the foreign value added, or in other words, imports used in production, electricity increases by 88%. It increases hugely, and gas falls by 36%. So basically, there's going to be a lot of imports of electricity within the region. And then actually later on, I'll talk about ASEAN grid, and that's an ongoing research we are doing, and that's also quite important. That given so much is going to be traded, that means that we also have to ensure that all the electricity that is traded is also green to avoid leakages to other countries. So now if you look at, again, the top losing sectors in the scenario 2, both the coal and gas sectors lose a lot, 31%, 37%. It's quite a big loss in terms of domestic value added. But in terms of light manufacturing and heavy manufacturing, there is a huge increase in Indonesia because of greening of those sectors, particularly the green part of the sectors are increasing. Demand for them is increasing from other countries. So these are basically foreign value added. So basically, Indonesia is going to reduce dependence on the domestic fossil fuels and import more from other countries. So that is, again, there is going to be some leakages unless other countries also reduce, and that's what is happening in scenario 2. Other countries also reduce their emissions, so it's becoming green. In terms of aggregate change in domestic value added, in the scenario 1, it is increasing slightly. In scenario 2, it is decreasing a lot. Again, foreign value added, in scenario 1, it is increasing more than domestic, and it is increasing way more than, in fact, it increasing a lot in scenario 2 in terms of foreign value added, but in scenario 2 in domestic value added, it actually decreases a lot. Again, going into other details of Indonesia, GDP slightly increases in scenario 1, but it falls a lot. There was 2% in scenario 2. Imports increase very, very negligibly. Exports increase very, very little. Whereas in scenario 2, they both decrease. Imports decrease a lot, exports decrease less. Now, if you see the investment in different sectors, so renewables investment increase a lot. Other sectors, there is not much change in investment. Same thing in the second scenario, but just the percentage change is so big. So it's almost doubling the investment in renewables. Here, the investment in renewables increases only by 9% compared to the baseline. So in other words, we need double the investment or maybe triple the investment, because 200% increase, which is basically tripling the investment. So you have to triple the investment going into renewables compared to the baseline to achieve net zero. So employment in the first scenario, we may see an increase in employment by 1.17 million people, not billion. Whereas in the second scenario, there is a decrease by 8 billion people. A lot of jobs may be lost because of the transition. So the top sectors that may gain are services, construction, processed food, grains, and crops. These are the sectors that are going to increase. And top export markets for Indonesia are going to be Japan, China, EU, US, and India. And these are top export commodities, top import sources. So now what we are saying is that there is going to be some reduction, again, as you can see here, large reduction in non-renewables and extraction sector in scenario 2. Scenario 1 is okay, it's business as usual. The renewables are going to increase, others are not going to change much. That's going to contribute. But if you're implementing all the commitments, then renewables are going to increase a lot. Transportation is going to increase, manufacturing is going to increase, agriculture is going to increase a little bit. But then extraction is going to fall, non-renewables is going to fall, and some services are going to fall. So we have to do something. Non-renewables is intended. It's okay. Extraction is also partly intended because a lot of these minerals are fossil fuels. But we have to minimize the losses in services, and we have to compensate these losses here by moving them into increase further in manufacturing and so on. So that is what we think the policymakers should do. How they have to minimize the losses. So the cost of reducing the emissions for each ASEAN members is about 50 billion US dollars, which is about 1.73% of ASEAN's GDP. So in value chain terms, if you look at the exports, imports, and so on, the disruptions are about 166 billion. This is for the entire ASEAN region. So basically what you're saying is that we can achieve these emission targets through strong investment, definitely, but also capacity building is required so that you can lead, you can develop those technologies required. But at the same time, we have to come up with very, very carefully thought out deployment strategies, because as I just mentioned, this level of reduction in sectors and this level of reduction in GDP is difficult to difficult to accept. So we have to basically do it in a very careful manner, and there has to be a set of policy measures that can help replacement of the non-renewable energy sources very effectively. And also we have to look at the different generation sources, decompose them into renewable and non-renewable, and track them, and increase investment in migrating to high efficiency sources, energy sources, or energy technologies, low emission energy sources, renewable energy generation technologies, solar, wind, hydro, and so on. This is a way to really achieve the increasing energy demand, and also not compromise on development, growth and development. I should also add nuclear to the mix, because nuclear is also pretty green, apart from the risks involved in radioactive material and so on, that we have to take into account. But otherwise, generally, nuclear is also a strategy. Now, I was just talking about the energy market, electricity. You saw here that electricity increase is very high from foreign value added. That means that the electricity should be, in order to green, we have to make sure that the renewable energy, potential is increased. Like if you take ASEAN region, 23% of renewable energy by 2025. That's a target. In terms of primary energy supply, 35% in terms of generation capacity. But there is a lot of potential. There's only 1% estimated potential has been used. So of course, huge growth and prosperity in the region. Crude oil price is also very volatile. Given all this, there is a lot of focus on renewables. We already discussed some of these things: 11%, 24% of emissions reduction, unconditional, conditional, and so on. So given all this, we are looking at ASEAN power grid, and that is again work in progress we are doing now, looking at various aspects there. We also did some work on one sun, one world, one grid, which is a slogan by the International Solar Alliance in India, in Jaipur. They have come up with this connecting multiple countries in terms of solar grid, so that you continue to harness the solar energy in one part of the world when the other part of the world is dark. So you can keep, for example, if you're connecting from Japan to, let's say, Europe, then when it is night in Japan, it is still day in Europe. So that if the grid is connected, so you can get the power in an uninterrupted way. So these kind of things are going on. So there is a lot of benefits. We looked at the literature. IEA has done some work on it. UNSCAP area and various others have done some work on it, and there is a lot of positive effects. And as I do the same model, when we try to do this analysis in different scenarios, we find pretty positive GDP impact when the countries can cooperate. So basically, that's the thing. So energy cooperation among countries is an important aspect, and we need dialogue among the countries to have political support, because so far we have been talking about the economic aspects, but how do we build consensus for this? So for that, we need political support. We also need investment. Where do we get the investments? And in the Indian context, this has been a major discussion going on. How do we get the investments needed for the greening? Is it going to come from private sector or government or international sources or a combination? What would then happen for like with the current account deficit or the fiscal deficit, depending on where the money is going to come from? So the investment requirement is really huge. So how do we take that into consideration is another major challenge. So these are some broad points I had to discuss, and I would probably conclude the presentation for now, and then open the floor for questions, because I wanted more interaction, and I can also discuss more about our other studies in India and African economies and Middle East and so on. I can explain them while I'm answering the questions. So thank you once again, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Badri, for a thought-provoking lecture. Basically, your vast experience is reflected in your presentation, starting from CG model to the GTAP database and how to use them for assessing the impacts of decarbonation. So before the floor is open, I have a questions. If you can throw some light on that, basically, how, given your experience, can you basically say how we can use this GTAP data to assess the distributional impacts of decarbonization policies across different income groups and regions? Because that is one question. Second question is what kind of methods you have used basically to validate this GTAP based model? So these two
Yeah,
questions, and you can say then people have already raised their hand. You can take a few questions. Thank you.
thank you, Dr. Harendra. So definitely these are very important and valid questions. On the distribution impact, in fact, these models can also, like I only showed national level results, but these models are also, we can also work on these models, customize these models to look at regional distributional impact, and also different types of households, different types of labor categories, and so on. In fact, we are actually currently doing some work for India, actually looking at different states in India, and also different income categories, and so on. So definitely there is a possibility to do this. For example, in the Indian context, we did some work looking at Odisha, Maharashtra, and Kerala. Odisha being a state which is rich in fossil fuels, and hence a lot of power capacity is also in non-renewable. Maharashtra has a mix, and it is mostly a consumer of fossil fuels, whereas it also has a lot of renewable capacity. And Kerala, which doesn't produce much power, and mostly whatever power it produces is mostly renewable. So we had these three types of states, and the implications were very different for these different states in terms of how are they going to reach their net zero goal by 2070, which the Prime Minister has announced for India, net zero transition by 2070. So definitely the distributional impact is an important aspect. There are some technical points to consider while doing that. First of all, we have to get the data. Like for the Indian context, it is maybe the NSS data to look at the consumption by different households, and labor, employment, and employment data, NSS consumption data, NSS employment and employment rounds. So all these different data sets have to be put together to decompose the national level input-output table into different states, different income categories, and so on. So my short answer to your question is it's definitely doable, and we are actually doing this kind of work. And I'll be probably in the future, whenever we are done, we can probably do another seminar where I can share these kind of things in detail. In the past also we have done, for example, in a very different context, not decarbonization, but in the context of National Food Security Act, some more than 12 years ago, when it was just announced, we did an analysis for India, looking at different types of households, and looking at the subsidies, which are actually food subsidies, are actually going to the lower income households. So how would, if you give subsidies tied with specific types of grains, what would be the consumption pattern, and the income, the distributional aspects? And if you do not, if you just give income transfer to the poorer households, what will be the consumption pattern? So you're looking at those kind of things, and overall economic implications of this kind of Food Security Act. So there are many such examples I can give in other countries as well, but I just want to give you these 2-3 things. Your second question is also very very valid and very important, which is about validation. How do you make sure this data, this model behaves realistically? So there is a lot of validation efforts done in Purdue when we develop the model and the data. We make sure that We do what we in econometrics in time series we call as in sample forecasting. We do a lot of prediction in the model of some of the things that happened in the past, and then try to understand how it works, and we'll fine tune some of the parameters based on it. So the parameters, as I told you, are mostly econometrically estimated. That itself is quite robust because you are using actual statistical data for that. But in addition to that, we also have some parameters which are calibrated. So those calibrated parameters we adjust based on the model behavior, how the model should behave realistically. So this validation is done. And beyond this, I would always warn people who use CGE, who develop CGE, who use CGE, the policymakers also, that any economic model, any quantitative model cannot claim itself to be accurate or precise when it comes to quantitative results, forecasts, predictions, and so on. Because there are so many unforeseen things that happen. But this is particularly true of CGE models, because CGE models are a very stylized and nice representation of the world as it stands today. The beauty about the CGE model is the way it captures the intersectoral linkages, international linkages, and the fact that the resources are limited and the scarcity of resources and so on. But you can never, if you notice the presentation I gave, you would not have seen anywhere I would mention this as a forecast from the model. So we'll never use the word forecast because these are actually not forecasts. These are more like potential impact of certain policy changes. I think that is something you have to keep in mind. So although the model validation has been done quite a bit, you still cannot claim that any model, particularly CGA models, like for example, all the numbers I showed you, one cannot say that this is exactly what is going to happen because of decarbonization. No, what is more important is the story. Like if you've seen my presentation, I talk more about, I don't give too much emphasis on the numbers. I don't say that, okay, GDP will increase by so much, decrease by so much, and so on. I just mention that in passing. But what is more important is the possibility that GDP may fall, because if we purely focus on indices, unless we do some kind of complementary policies. So that those kind of influences are those kind of insights and influences are more important. But definitely your question is still valid, because we don't want the model to be directionally wrong and not capturing reality is well enough. So that is why we do all this validation. But even after that, we have to be very humble. We should not say that the model is really well defined and well validated, so it can, all the results coming from it are realistic. But of course, one more thing I wanted to add is, even in terms of this validation and so on, the tricky thing is, even from the past data, I'm talking about futuristic results, right? But even from the past data, it is very difficult to say what is the impact of a particular policy change. It's going to depend on the kind of model assumptions that we use, the different econometric methods, time series methods, panel data methods, whatever we use. So it's going to be very much dependent on that, and the results can vary from model to model. Even I'm talking about the policy impact of in the past. Even that is quite difficult to determine. So from that perspective, even if you wait until 2030 and see what really happens in the economy, and then compare that with the model, it would actually be impossible, because that particular empirical estimation of the past results is going to depend on the model choice, the model assumptions, variables, and so on. So we cannot think of the model results, the numbers that you have, in a very sacrosanct way. So we should think of these model numbers as guiding forces, and then pay more attention to what is increasing, what is decreasing, and if all the results that we show are broadly consistent with logical, economic, theoretical explanations. If they are not consistent, then we have to dig deeper and find why they are not consistent. So that is, and if they're not, I mean, apparently they're not consistent, that means we may have some deeper explanation. So sometimes, I'll give you one example. If certain prices are increasing and still the demand is increasing, you may think that it is counterintuitive and illogical. But in CG model, this can happen from time to time. The reason is when prices increase, then the returns to the factor for that particular product also increases. That means the labor income, the wages also increase. That means the income, household income also increases. So you have the income increasing and prices increasing. So the net result of that is going to be depending on how much is the income effect, how much is the price effect or substitution effect. So the net result of the two is going to be the total effect on the demand. So it can very well be positive because your price increases may drive your demand for factors and higher income, and more income means more demand. More prices means less demand, but then there's more income. The income-driven demand increase is higher than the price-driven demand decrease. So these kind of things are possible. So here I was able to explain to you again based on theory, but if you just blindly look at prices increasing and demand increasing, you'll say the model is wrong because I cannot imagine demand increasing and prices increasing. But then when you see, okay, income is increasing more than that, and hence demand is increasing, then it becomes insightful. So these are the things that we always look in the CG models. A lot of things that we do not think systematically, although we know all these theories, these things come out from a CG model after running the simulations and looking at all these results. So from that perspective, validation is important to make sure that this kind of combinations are done appropriately in a realistic way. So I hope I answered your questions, Dr. Harendra.
Yes.
So,
Thank you. Thank you for those practically relevant answers. So now the floor is open. I think one people can ask simply unmuting their mic. Thank you.
Yeah. Am I audible? Should I come in?
Yes,
yes,
you are
yes, yeah.
Yeah, Professor Badri, very comprehensive, very detailed. So we enjoyed the presentation. I'm sorry I missed the initial part. I'm traveling. I'm in Hyderabad now, just reached and I opened my system. Now, I had a couple of questions or dimensions which I wanted to bring to the table for some insight or some discussion possible. One is from the technology point of view, and other is from the institutional point of view. And it's related more to CGE rather than to any immediate impacts in terms of decarbonization effect. Now, considering technology, now in an age of IoTs, now, how much scope would there be to look into sectoral changes when AI directed IoTs? How much of technology can be incorporated in value terms or in more machine terms, in the sense that if we are able to incorporate, can we think in terms of a policy direction where we are not moving from technology to economics, but from economics to technology, decentralized or desegregated technology? That is one question. The second is, if we are looking from an institutional approach, now Ekerlof, of course, and company got this prize, Nobel Prize, in terms of the political power approach. Now, political power, prima facie, can be looked at in terms of how much influence it is yielding and whether that influence can be monetized. And the other would be a little bit more concrete, perhaps, in terms of developing maybe more sophisticated or more intricate or more grassroots level financial institutions. So in what way can one look into a CGE model incorporating these institutions, because immediately if I am asked, my mind would be going to a little bit of linkage analysis thinking and location and localization analysis thinking and a cluster level thinking. Is there any other way in which we can look into it, or any other suggestions you would like to have? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Devasis. These are very insightful questions. When it comes to your first question about AI and IoTs and all these transformations that are happening, yes, that is a major challenge in CGE models is that um, unless we tell the model or the data set to change or transform the economic structure over time, or production technologies and so on over time, the model would not do it so comprehensively. So in our context, when we are looking at decarbonization, we are slightly better off because uh, we have this substitution between different fuels, and when carbon tax is introduced, then there is an incentive to substitute away from fossil fuels and towards renewables. So that is very helpful to transform the input-output table from sectors that are fossil fuel intensive to renewable intensive. In this example that you gave with AI and other transformations, this will unfortunately not be the case, because we are not able to predict and envision what kind of changes are coming because of AI. Because then, even forget about economists, even the technologies are not able to predict. So generative AI was surprise for even many AI specialists when it came up in the way that has come up. So it is going to be very challenging. So all that we can do is to take into account whatever is the best information available today about the future, and then insert those insights into the model. So I've done some work on this future of the economies with AI and all these new technologies, IoT, blockchain, and so on. When we do that, we take into account productivity changes, obviously. So you're going to produce more with less, and also there are going to be changes in the inputs required for production. Like 3D printing, for example. Like when you have 3D printing become a big deal, then the labor arbitrage doesn't anymore exist, because you can you just use a 3D printer and print it sitting in the US rather than importing it from Vietnam, because Vietnam US difference is mainly the industrial ecosystem and labor cost. And if you can use a 3D printer to print something, you can just do it here. So I think these are the things that are really going to be very crucial. So we have to understand the technologies. We have to move away from our position and experience as an economist, stand on the shoes of technologists and try to understand really what is coming. And then we have to come back to economics and modify the things. So in the CGE models, in some of the models that I worked on before, I tried to do that. So I talk to the technology people and see what is happening, and then say, okay, this is what will happen. This is what it means. I mean, the easiest way to model these things is saying that, okay, productivity will increase. If AI comes in, productivity will increase by 50%, 60%, 70%. Okay, that is great, and that is a reasonably good way to do it. But we have to go a little deeper. We have to say, how are we going to change things that we are doing? Like this 3D printing example that I gave you. So I think these are the ways to look at this kind of modeling. And I don't have a very clear-cut answer to that, because it's going to depend on all these various parameters. But the broad approach should be we have to be very considerate of what is happening in this in the technology sector. And also there are other aspects, other ways in which we can envision transformation. Like in the, let's say I do a lot of work with Saudi Arabian government. And Saudi government, they have this Vision 2030, and we were developing that a few years ago. When we developed that, the vision was very, very ambitious. So, for example, even now they don't produce many automobiles, but by 2030 they want to be a leading exporter of automobiles. So it's a very, very transformational vision targets are there. So the only way to tackle that is to change the data, the input-output tables in a way that over time you reach those targets. Over time, from zero, you move to like $100-200 million in a couple of years to billions of dollars in another couple of years, and so on. And that happens through a wide range of policy parameters, through through investments, subsidies, and so on. So that is those are some aspects to consider in that. But apart from that, I think the second question about the political power
Institutions,
and
political power, financial institutions also.
financial institutions. Yeah, the institutional aspect there. So there, I think the way we can there is no direct way of dealing with a lot of these things in a purely quantitative approach. What we can do here is we can definitely come up with different scenarios. So we can have different scenarios in the model. Here I showed only two scenarios. But we can develop different scenarios where we can explain those scenarios based on institutional economics using these theories of political power and so on. So basically, you may have noticed by now that when I told you those two scenarios, it almost appeared as if these are given. But no, we put in a lot of thought before coming up with these scenarios, right? So in any comprehensive data study, we come up with like many scenarios, and designing these scenarios can be based on different considerations of institutional aspects and this political power, financial institutions, and so on. So, particularly financial institutions, for example, I mentioned about the investments that can come into decarbonization, reduce emissions, and so on. So right now we assume that the investments somehow come in from domestic sources, from other countries, and so on. But that mechanism is not. We don't pay much attention to that mechanism. Let's assume, because that's not the central.
If I may just come in here, you talked of the two scenarios in institution building. Can we look into two types of, let us say, or multiple utility scenarios where it has to be backed by a certain demand from the consumer side? Only then there is a possibility of the institutions and investments taking over. Am I right? Or no, I need to change my thinking.
Yeah, that is one approach, definitely. And we have some models in which we have willingness to pay. The consumers, how much are they willing to pay to towards environmental causes, to move towards green energy and so on. So are they willing to pay a higher price for a green product? So that is definitely one. That is, I would say, that is one of the many possibilities, right? So other possibilities may be government providing subsidies for this. Currently, we don't assume that. So in another model, another scenario, we can assume that.
Policy directions also.
Policy directions, yeah.
Macroeconomic scenarios can be there. Yeah, I understand now. Thank you. Yeah, great.
Yeah, different macroeconomic scenarios, and maybe we can have some implications of what happens to the World Bank and IMF if they become more sustainability focused. So all these, and even political economy, like based on some elections. For example, in the U.S. election now, there is a widespread belief that this election is going to determine where U.S. is going to stand in the global climate change scenario debate and so on, and that may also affect the global positions in climate change. So these political battles are also important to be considered in terms of scenarios.
Right. I think I have a small question. I'm Chinmay Vera here. So very nice kind of informative sort of session here. But my question is little technical in nature. There are a lot more trend is happening recently where DID is used extensively, basically on the towards the environmental economics and all. So I just wanted to know what is the limitation of CG model, whether he has a potential to capture any shocks come to the market, structural shocks, and how if you compare between DID model and to CG model, which one will be better when you use choose the model, right model?
No, great question, Dr. Chinmaya. In fact, I myself, before starting, working on CG models, I myself, my background was completely into applied industrial organization and applied econometrics. So even now I continue to dabble with different methods. So for me, the methods are just tools. The question and how do we address it is more important. And in this context, I would say that DID and CG are very complementary. There is no competition because DID is more about looking at the past data, right? It is more empirical, like looking at the past, looking at a particular, let's say, program and do some program evaluation, how it performed in the past. Whereas CG is primarily for future. And I say they are complementary because if you do some analysis using DID and you're able to find that a particular policy has had certain clear-cut impact on a particular policy, a particular macro variable or something, let's say productivity or something, then in the CG model, we can apply that in another context. So, let's say that in India, let's say you're doing a DID for, let's say, Manrega. So you're doing, you're able to find that Manrega leads to 1% more expenditure for Manrega is going to lead to 0.5% increase in employment. Let's say you get something like that. Then what I would do in a CG model is that in the future, if Manrega budget is increased by 10%, then in my model I can say accordingly the employment will increase by 0.5%, and then I can shock the model based on that, and then the model will say what are the macroeconomic implications of increasing the labor supply or employment by 0.5%. So you're translating the question of the future budget increases in Manrega into future increases in labor supply in employment. So I think this kind of collaboration between different models, particularly these models that focus on the past and the models that focus on the future. And CG is definitely the second category where we are looking at the future. So these two we can combine together, and actually in other words, we are like when we drive a car, we look at the look towards the front, but we also look at the rear view mirror. So the econometric approaches are like the way we are looking at the rearview mirror, and then we keep going forward using the simulation model kind of approach, CG model kind of approach. So I would say that the only like example I can right now think of where you can choose between a CG model and an econometric model would be, let's say, we look at macroeconometric models, which also have a similar characteristic of going in the future, coming up with some explanations of the future. And nowadays, there is also some models in the gravity literature, in the trade and gravity literature, where they've also began to incorporate some of the CG aspects there. And if you're purely interested in macro models, you can also go into DSG models. Macro, particularly if you're interested in money supply, interest rates, and so on, then DSG models are better. So, because in the CG models, I didn't mention clearly so far, these are based on relative prices with respect to numeraire. So it's a real model. There is no nominal variable here. So you cannot, if you want to understand the impact of nominal exchange rates or nominal interest rates and so on, or money supply and so on, then the CG models cannot be directly used. So in those contexts, you can actually run this DSG or other models. And then if you want to understand sectoral implications, you can come to CG because these macro models don't go into the sectoral detail. So further, you can come to CG. So in a lot of my studies, projects, and consulting work, advisory work, I combine all these different approaches: CGs, econometrics, time series methods, even machine learning, data science kind of methods, and very importantly, theoretical aspects, economic theory. So we have to combine all these different approaches, and that would enrich. I mean, particularly, I'm talking about particularly policy research. When it comes to academic research for publishing papers and so on, we have to be very focused on a question and then see whatever methodology is useful to address that. So in that context, many times you would use either econometrics or CGE, and there are some instances I have used both in academic papers also. But typically, the academic research tries to focus on just one methodology to address a particular policy question. But the short answer to your question is, there is, there are a lot of opportunities to mix different methods. CG can take in other kinds of methods and inputs from them to do the analysis, including the DID that you mentioned.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I think some other people have also raised their hand. If they want to ask, they can ask quick questions. Otherwise, we can. I think
One question in the message there, that how they can learn the CG model. So one question from a participant side.
Yeah, that's a good question, and definitely there are many ways to learn. For example, there is one textbook by one of my friends and colleagues, Dr. Mary Burfisher. It's called Introduction to CGE Modeling. That's a pretty good book, and it also provides a lot of exercises to learn. But if you like more hands-on learning without getting into books, then if you go to the GTAB website, gtab.org, you actually can download the software, and the software has some kind of a hands-on document. And the hands-on document is basically, it has a good combination of technical, theoretical aspects and how to use the software kind of aspects. And then you can implement all the steps provided there. And there is also a very detailed book on GTAB, which is Cambridge University Press book, which is also freely available online in the GTAB website. So you can download that and simultaneously read these theories, the principles, the equations, the mathematical aspects, and so on. and implement that in the model, in the software, because the model itself has been developed in a very versatile, in a very user-friendly way, so that anyone can access it and start implementing it relatively easily, without having to have a lot of IT or mathematical background. But at the same time, having access to this kind of robust methods that are running in the background, so that is the back end and the front end will be relatively easy to understand. So I would suggest to look at all these things, and also you can feel free to contact me, and maybe the other CG modelers who are there, they also will be willing to help you. I'm also willing to help, and I also try to conduct some Gyan workshops on this from time to time. I've done two so far. One was with NIT Trichy, and one was with IIT Hyderabad recently. So I also try to do that, and there are many courses also done by institutions like Purdue University, and there are some other private players who are doing this also. So you can keep an eye on these kind of things, because CD modeling also requires a lot of teamwork and collaborations and so on. So while you can learn with all these methods I told you, it also requires some ecosystem, some talking to certain people from time to time to see if you are on the right track and so on. So I think for that is only possible if you join a community. So if you go to a course or go to some conferences, interact with people and so on. So I think it's a combination of all these things, but there is enough set of resources available online to learn these things without any cost.
Thank you, Badri. Now, may I request Professor Rajesh Varik to extend the vote of thanks.
Very good morning to all. So, firstly, I would like to sincerely give a thankfulness to Professor Badri Narayan for his insightful and thought-provoking lecture on the topic of global economic implication on decarbonization. I would say your presentation was not only informative, but also it was deeply engaging also, and it provided a fresh and practical approach or perspective on the issues of your economic implication of decarbonization. Right? And we also had a very comprehensive discussion on the issues of your CG model. Next, I would also extend my thankfulness to our Society President, Dr. Harendra Kumar Behra, for his, spending his valuable time and chairing this session also. Then, as I can see that participants have, across all over the world, starting from central universities, some universities in outside also. Then IITs, IIM people have also joined. So I would like to extend my thankfulness to all the participants who have actively participated in this lecture and for making this event great success. So thank you everyone once again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can close this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.